Hi friends, today we're going to be going over how to measure proficiency or mastery. This is the step that is the hardest for everybody. The other things are, believe it or not, the low-hanging fruit. This is where you have to really dig in and get your work done. So I'm going to be going through the 5 steps as an overview, and then we're going to be breaking them down in each module. So let's get started. All right, the first thing I want to do is introduce you to some books that really made a change in my thinking and my understanding of this whole mastery-based or proficiency-based process. This is the first book that I read that really spoke to me, and it's called Beyond Reform. I got all these books on Amazon. I don't get any money from any of these people, but for me, I'm the person who buys a lot of books because I'm motivated, but I don't necessarily read them all. These are the ones that caught my attention, and I actually read them. So that might tell you something. This first one, Beyond Reform, is related to Bob Marzano, who is really a leading person with personalized learning, and it's competency-based. That's what makes it personalized. And it was Lindsay Unified School District in California, which is about 90% Hispanic, a lot of English language learners, kids who were struggling, and they turned their district around. So that was incredibly motivating because I work with a lot of Title I schools, and a lot of what is in books does the kids don't look like my kids, and they don't act like my kids, and they're just sometimes I just didn't feel like they were speaking to me. So this was the first one that spoke to me. Okay, after that, I read The Standards-Based Classroom. This is by 2 teachers out of Vermont. I was shocked to realize that personalized learning's been around for a long time, and I am only just catching up. This is about 12 or 15 years into their odyssey, and they go through very clearly how they used to do things one way and how they do them now. So you get to see that progression that almost helps you to see where you need to be. So where am I now? And I'm exactly where I was when they were starting, and so it is possible for me to get to where they are. Some really revolutionary thinking in that book. And it's really about how teachers think about learning, and they set up their master standards or power standards to cover almost any content area. So their standards are very global. Definitely worth a read. This one really helped me to see the process laid out, because this book, When They Already Know It, is about those kids at the top who learn it quickly, or they come into your class already knowing it, and how are we going to extend for those kids? So if you read this one and you start with your high-performing kids, then you can let it trickle down to your other kids. A lot of times we start at the bottom and work our way up, but what you might find if you do it the other way is that the kids who are super bright, or who learn quickly, or who learned it somewhere else, they might be problems in your class because they are bored. So in starting with them, you might be able to learn the process, but also cut down on some behavior problems and increase how these kids feel about learning. And then if they are on their path to learning, then you might find other kids who want to do it that way and might say, can we do that too? Or you might find kids who are striving to get to where those kids are. So this one for me was really good at breaking down the process. This one, How to Personalize Learning, is by Barbara Bray and Kathleen McClaskey. If you are not following them on Twitter, and if you have not gone to their website and signed up, subscribed to get information, These two are mind-blowing. They're wonderful. So I definitely recommend anything by the two of them. This one, Reclaiming Personalized Learning. I saw a webinar by Paul, and he is the most student-centered teacher I have ever experienced. And after the webinar, I looked him up and I saw that he had made this book, and this subtitle right here, A Pedagogy for Restoring Equity and Humanity in Our Classrooms. It was the humanity part that got me. And so one of the things that he really drives home is that if you put a kid in front of a computer, it can be helpful, but it can also be dehumanizing. So it's when it is dehumanizing that we have a problem. And that might be a really important point to be thinking about as we are encouraging remote learning and learn on your own. We have to make sure that we are including activities that are humanizing. So his book, I'm not going to be going into his book, but I definitely recommend it as a read. Okay, so there are 5 steps that I'm going to lay out. Other people might describe it in 4 or 6. These are the steps that I think will help you the most. So the first is choosing your super standards. The second is unpacking the standards. And I know that unpacking the standards is kind of a dirty phrase right now in education. I didn't like it. I didn't want to do it. But when I finally sat down and did it, I had the aha moment. So as somebody who dug her heels in, I'm here to tell you that unpacking the standards really does work. So we'll be going through that. Creating learning targets is the next step from unpacking the standards. So some school districts started unpacking standards, but the teachers never got to the next step, which is the reason that you actually unpack the standards. So you have to create learning targets. And then from the learning targets, you have to create learning progressions. So think about the bullseye, right? The learning target is that center, and then those other rings are the learning progressions. So which ring am I on? And then finally, you're going to create your assessments. So based on your learning targets and your standards. All right, so where to begin? Well, it takes leadership to get this done. So if you're the only person in your school who is doing this, then you are the leader. So anytime I talk about leadership, I'm talking about you, right? But it also might be a principal who is progressive and has been to a conference and is on fire for this. So it could be the school leadership, or it could be a district, a full district. And when I talk about leadership, I'm going to be talking about the district office leadership. So here we go. District or grade level, or it could be department leadership, right? So if you're doing it full school, your principal or your leadership council might decide at the elementary level, we're going to do it by grade level, which completely makes sense. And if you're at middle and high, it might be department leadership. So the first thing you have to do, whoever the leader is in the leadership group, you have to settle on the essential skills and standards or power standards. So what we all know is that we can't cover all the standards. Let's just put it out there. There are too many standards to cover. So when we're doing our mastery-based learning or standards-based or proficiency-based, whatever you're going to call it, you have to decide what are the most important things that you're going to cover. And then you have to cover them first, right? So some people will argue, well, if we're doing just the power standards, then my kid's not going to get all of the fine details. Well, you have to think about it this way, or maybe you should think about it this way. Can I cover all the standards and only get 70% of the kids with me? And then of all of those standards, how much did the kids actually learn? Even the brightest, how much did he learn? Or can we do the power standards and know for sure that our students are ready to move on to the next level? So we have to think about things in terms of investing our energy and planning for the next step. So the next thing, leadership also is going to need to revamp district assessments. And these are the benchmarks, right? So if your benchmarks aren't aligned with your power standards, then you're going to have a problem. So they're going to have to make sure that that is done. And then they also need to work on changing the attitude and process surrounding assessments. So what that means is this. Assessments in the past were kind of like a line, and it was you did an assessment, you did an assessment, you did an assessment in the form of 3 quizzes, right? And they led up to the test. And then the kids were supposed to review the quizzes before the test, and if they didn't, well, it's on them. That's really not what works. It's not learner-centered. So what we have to do is we have to have this cyclical form for assessment. So we assess as a pre-assessment or a diagnostic, and then that should inform our instruction because I know what student needs what. Now, you see this learning in the middle. The assessment can be a learning tool, right? So it's to assess for learning and assess as they are learning. So I can instruct and then I can assess again. My assessment, though, sometimes it might be an activity that helps them learn. And it's not being graded per se. It's being used to give feedback. And then in that feedback, they're also learning through their assessment and they're learning through their instruction. So I can give feedback about the assessment, but my instruction is also going to help them learn and then give them more feedback. So assessments, quizzes are not for gotcha moments. I know teachers who use quizzes as gotcha moments. I once sent an email to one of my children's teachers, and I said, "There's only one quiz in the in Power School, and quizzes are worth 30%. So that one quiz is worth 30% of his grade." So the teacher gave them a pop quiz the next day, and it was really as a punishment, and it was to put me in my place. Because my son came home and said, "Thanks a lot, Mom. We had a pop quiz that everyone bombed," right? So you can see how that wasn't helpful, right? That wasn't being used to instruct. It wasn't used for feedback. So that's the kind of mentality that we've got to change. All right, now, how do you figure out your essential standards or skills? Well, sometimes it's already done for you, right? So the EOC, I'm just going to use English 2 EOC as my example. The English EOC has a set breakdown, and they tell you what percentage of which standards are on the test. So clearly, reading for literary text and informational text are going to be your power standards, right? So that's going to be 60% of the EOC. Writing is going to be 20%. So these 3 are where I'm going to spend the majority of my time and energy, and then I am going to thread in inquiry-based literacy as well as communication. Over here, this is a breakdown of how many different types of items are on the test, and this is from USA Test Prep. Reading for literature, 30 to 34. That's pretty good. That's pretty close. Reading for information, 32 to 38. Writing, language. Okay, so they've included these communication and inquiry based in other ways. So this is another way that you can break down, where are you going to start? And then you can start looking at your standards. So as you are in this phase, go out and look to see which tests have already been released by the states, which teachers have websites that have released questions on them. Find teachers in states who have already done this, right? You're not the first person to do it. Just like I told you in Vermont, they've been doing this for 15 years. So we're way far behind the curve. So look first for who's done it and then analyze what they've done, because standards change, and then move forward. All right, step 2 is dissecting the standards. So some people call this unpacking standards. For me, it really is dissecting them, because what do you have to do? First, you identify all the nouns and verbs, and we'll be doing this in depth in a later module, but you have to identify the nouns and the verbs. Why? Because you're going to be creating tasks from those nouns and verbs. So the verbs are the actions to be done, and the nouns are the topics to be covered and the artifacts to be created. So why? What's the why? So that's the how, but what's the why? The why for teachers and learners is that it simplifies the standard. I have read my standards and just rolled my eyes because they were either too vague or they were too huge, right? And I was English, so you can see how English might be that way. So it simplifies the standard for the teacher and the learner. It also helps you, when you unpack it with your students, to put it in kid-friendly language so the kids understand what they're supposed to be learning. If the kids don't understand what they're supposed to be learning, that's like having a soccer field with no goal. There's no net. So the kids don't know where they're supposed to be kicking, right? Kid-friendly language is super important, and doing it with the kids is important. Dissecting the standards also gives kids and teachers a clear path for demonstrating mastery, and you'll be able to see that in the next few slides. So step 2 is dissecting the standards. Step 3, once you have dissected your standards, you're going to create learning targets, okay? So just like I talked about the bullseye, that's why it's called a target, because you have to know what is inside that bullseye. So how do you do it? Well, you break down the indicators for the standard, and you're going to create I can statements that tell the students what they have to do to show mastery. In other words, you are giving them a goalpost, right? So here's an example. I can explain the rotation of the moon and Earth. It doesn't tell me how I have to do that, right? I can explain. I could do a YouTube video. I could do a podcast. I could do an audio recording. I could write it out. I could do an animation. So that's where you leave it a little bit vague so that students have a choice in how they are going to show mastery. The second example, I can show the solar system with all planets and sun in their proper place. Instead of saying the project is that you're going to build a mobile or you're going to do a diorama, leave it vague and just say show. And then the kids can decide if they want to show it in a slide presentation, or if they want to show it using a 3D model, or if they want to draw it. But it would have to be something visual because the verb says show, okay? So why do you want to do this? Well, again, it creates a clear path for building to standard mastery. So the I can statement is it's going to break down the standard, right? And to be able to master the standard, you have to do all of the indicators. So now I have a path, or at least I have a group, right? It can create scaffolding for learning. So depending on whether the indicators build upon one another, like in math, or not, it could create scaffolding. It can also be represented in a checklist. And this makes it easy to track for students and teachers. So once it is easy to track, the student is able to self-evaluate, to keep track, to set goals, to see if they're behind. It becomes very concrete, which is positive, okay? All right, so once you've created your learning targets, so I have my bullseye for my standard. Now I'm going to create learning progressions. So each of those targets or bullseyes is going to have its own learning progression. So this is where the scaffolding really comes in. The learning progressions look like rubrics, but they're not really the same. And I'll be explaining why in the future. You're going to create a 3 or a 4-point scale depending on what your school or district decides. Most people do 4. Those scales are going to show how close a person is to mastery. If you're using a 4-point scale, 3 is usually mastery, and then 4 enables a student to go beyond. So remember that book that says what to do when they already know it? If they've already met a 3 when they come in your class, your 4 is going to help them go deeper or go beyond or apply it in some way that is interesting to the student. So that's why you need to have a 4. The learning progression or the learning scale needs to be in all positive language. Rubrics tend to tell you what you're missing. Learning progressions tell you where you are. So learning progressions should only have positive statements. What were you able to do? And then I know in which block I fall, and I can look to the next block to see where my goal is, right? There's that goal post again. What is my goal post? What am I shooting for? Because if I don't know, I'm not going to find it, okay? So again, you're going to avoid telling what they cannot do because that's not helpful. They have to know, I can do this. It's about attitude. Where are you? What can you do, right? If someone says, well, sorry, you didn't do A, B, and C, I walk away feeling a little bit disheartened, right? A little crushed because nobody's recognizing what I did. But if you say, hey, it looks like right now you're able to do A, B, and C, so where do you need to be next? And the student looking at it can look at the next level and say, okay, so I need to be able to do it on my own. Right now I can do it with your help, but I need to be able to do it on my own. And then I can say, okay, so what do you think? What's your plan? What's your plan of action? And then the student will tell me, and then we can, this is where your feedback is coming in, right? You're guiding them, you're helping them, they're making choices on their own. And if you think about if kids are at home doing this versus in school, these are the skills we need to give them so that we can conference with them online in a Zoom or a Google Meet, and we can still go over these things. They are setting their own goals, and then they are going to try to meet their goals. It's internal motivation, right? Instead of being told. Okay, now, why is this important? Kind of what I just said, right? It gives them a clear objective of where they are. It enables them to self-evaluate. They can also do peer evaluation. So those online meetings don't have to be led by a teacher. Our students are able to create Google meetings or Zoom meetings or Microsoft Team meetings with their learning partner. You could call them an accountability partner, and they are going to evaluate one another's work. And if they have a learning progression and they look over the work, they can say, oh, I think you're at a 2. This is why I think you're at a 2. Where do you think you are, right? So we've got a concrete path for success. And these learning progressions, they are a lot of work, and they are so worth it. Step 4 is creating assessments. So a lot of us have created assessments, and then we look to see what standards we covered. In fact, we need to do it a little bit differently, or a lot of bit differently, right? What we need to do is we need to look at our standards first, and we need to create assessments that really meet our learning progressions. So if our learning progression says that a student can consistently multiply 3-digit numbers by 2-digit numbers, then we would need to have a section that is just 3 digits by 2 digits. We need to decide what is considered consistent. Is 4 out of 5 consistent? Is 5 out of 5 consistent? Is 3 out of 5 consistent? And so that needs to be in our learning target. And then from our learning target, we can create our assessment so that from that section, we know whether or not the student has mastered it and where they fall in the progression. So it's a very different way of creating an assessment. It also is not to be a punishment, right? The assessment should be created so that the learner can figure out how well he or she does something, and then he or she can decide, what do I need to do to get to mastery? So when you are making your assessments, you need to tag your questions. I personally like to do sections. Each section is going to be focused on one learning target or one standard. And you want to make sure that your questions are really assessing the nouns and verbs from the standard. So if it says that they need to demonstrate, then that's what you should be asking them to do. If it says to show, or if it says to explain, or if it says to identify, right? Some of the standards might be at the lower levels of Bloom's. Make sure that your assessments are doing that. Okay, why is it important for teachers to do this? And why is it important for learners to have assessments like this? Well, if you use your assessments in this way, then it aligns with everything else you've done, and it's going to provide information to guide instruction and learning. Students to see what she or he can and cannot do. So I see my strengths and I see my weaknesses. If I get a quiz back and it says 70%, all I see is weakness. If I get a quiz back and it says 90%, all I see is strength. But I don't really know what I know, right? So if it's broken down, and eventually I think we're going to be going away from numbers and percents altogether because they're really not helpful. So those assessments also let me know if I know my strengths and I know my weaknesses, then I can look at my weaknesses and say, okay, I need to have an action plan for how am I going to get better at this. So right away, I can look at the learning progression and I can say, well, this is where I am right now, and this is what I'm shooting for. Okay, so I can choose to, if there's a list that the teacher has compiled, which is always a good idea, I can conference with my teacher and we can talk about which of those activities might be the best thing for me to do, or the teacher might already have them blocked off for scaffolding. There are all different kinds of ways that it can be done. Different subjects lend themselves to different methods, so there is no one way, but in future modules, I will be showing you some. All right, so the key takeaways, and this is my own learning. Unpacking the standards really is essential. Even though we're tired of hearing it, we hate those words, right? Unpacking standards. So just try to get over it, and once you do it, you'll see the power in it, and it's not going to bother you anymore. All right, defining your learning targets is absolutely essential. It's essential for student agency, right? It's essential for their independence and their empowerment and their overall success, okay? And the success of this whole method really relies upon having learning targets, and they need to be done well, right? So if you're only half-heartedly doing it, you're only going to be halfway successful. So it's, and of course, in the beginning, you're not going to do it right. You're going to make mistakes, and that's okay, right? Because you throw it out there, you try, and then you hone it, and you'll get better and better and better. Okay, we can't teach everything. So you're going to have to focus on your super standards, teach them really well. New methods of assessment are definitely necessary for personalization. So assessments aren't always going to be paper and pencil too, right? If the standard says explain something, then it could be that you're sitting with a student and you say, okay, the student gets to decide, I'm ready to be assessed. Okay, I have a block of time that I set in my classroom, and this is my assessment time. Other people are working on their learning progressions, right? They're all in different places because they know what they need to be doing. And this might be a time where kids can go online and sign up for a time with me using either, if you use G Suite, you can do that on your calendar and block off time. You can also use things like Calendly and youcanbook.me, so kids can sign up for a time. It's very empowering for kids to decide when they're going to be assessed, right? So anyway, the kids can also, decide that they're going to make a slides presentation, or they could use technology or they could not use technology, right? They might fall back on paper and pencil, and that's okay. So there's a cycle. Another key takeaway is that there is a cycle, and it's assessment, instruction, feedback, rinse, and repeat. It doesn't necessarily every cycle go in that order. It could be assessment, feedback, instruction, feedback, assessment, right? So be flexible. Technology can dehumanize the learning process if we are not careful. So we have to remember that people are social. Whether they are introverts or extroverts, they are social. If they are extroverts, they are especially social. So here's where knowing our students, our learner profile, is going to be super important. If we're doing all remote learning, and right now we have been, then we have to take those things into consideration as we are planning our instruction and our lessons. Scales, also known as progressions, are a must for self-guided work and clear expectations. So the progressions and the scales are the goalposts, right? And they also could be thought of as your yards on a football field. How close am I to the goal? Pre-assessments are absolutely necessary. How can we decide where to start if we don't know what our kids know? So the pre-assessments are the same as in a doctor's office. You go in and the doctor speaks to you and asks you a lot of questions, right? To figure out what is the problem. So in our pre-assessments, it is our assessment of our patient. We have got to figure out what they need. We don't say to them, today's Wednesday, everybody gets antibiotics no matter what's wrong with you, right? We give medicines that are necessary or treatments that are necessary for the situation. We have got to start thinking about our pre-assessments that way, the same way doctors do. Okay, it's a hell of a lot of work. Do not do it alone. Find a partner. If there's nobody in your school, some of the schools I work with, there's only one teacher per grade. Do not feel like you're an island. Reach out on Twitter, reach out in Google Groups, find somebody who is doing the same thing and share the work. Look for stuff online. It's way too much to do it by yourself, right? And if you are going to do it by yourself, do not expect yourself to do it for every lesson the first year, right? The teachers that I coach, we started them off and we said, it is reasonable for you to try to do this for every third unit. If you only have 6 units, then you're going to do it for 2. In the next year, you're going to add 2 more units. So you go from having a third of your curriculum done this way. The next year, you've got 2. And by the end of the 3rd year, you've got your entire curriculum done. The teachers who have moved to this have said, I never thought I would like it. And now that I'm really into it, I could never go back to the old system. So those are some things to think about, okay? Teachers, just like students, will grow one level at a time. So we have to be patient. If you are a coach, you have to be patient with your teachers. If you are the teacher, you have to give yourself grace. You have to know that you are not a superhero, although you kind of are, but you don't have superpowers, right? And you have to give yourself grace. Figure out a plan, just like SMART goals, right? You cannot do this all in one year by yourself. If there's somebody with you, do it together and still only expect to get 1 unit done, right, for every 3, or however you decide to work that out. All right, so we're going to be breaking this down because this is a lot of just background information. I wanted you to see the big picture, and now we're going to be digging in.